Okay, so welcome, Kyle. I don't actually know how to say your last name.
Kuzel, Kyle Kuzel.
Kuzel. Okay,
Yeah.
so Kyle is a licensed clinical social worker and is in private practice doing couples therapy for adults and therapy with children who have trauma. You also do trauma therapy for adults as well?
Yeah, yeah. I in my practice is pretty eclectic. I do a little bit of everything. It's something I really enjoy, having a chance to see a little bit of everything. A good part of my career was spent specifically doing trauma work,
Okay,
and as much as I enjoyed it, um, I do like the variety. People are interesting to me, and seeing all of that in my practice has been something I've enjoyed.
awesome. I also have here that you enjoy hiking, gardening in your greenhouse with your family, and playing Minecraft with your kids. Wait, is your greenhouse in your house?
So it's a little tiny greenhouse that we use to get our seeds and flowers and plants started.
Mhm.
This weekend, we're going to start moving some things into the garden. That's the big project now. Some of the gardening experts listening might think that that's a little bit early, and it's a risk I'm willing to take. So
Okay, well, it
it's,
sounds like fun anyway.
yeah, yeah.
All right, so I have you on as an expert for couples therapy and whatever extraneous mental health topics we land on. So, do you have anything else that you want to share about yourself before we start in?
Yeah, so I guess some of the things that might come up as we talk, we can get more into. But for a good part of my career, I carried a license in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And when I was working at Family and Children's Sexual Abuse Treatment Program, which I believe is called the Journey Project now, and that's where I was able to get that certification. I don't maintain it anymore, but the knowledge and experience is still with me for sure. And working in that environment is sort of where I got used to um, working with families and couples, because a lot of times with abuse, it has impact on the whole family, not just, and trauma really impacts the whole family, not just the person that it happened to.
Hmm.
So I got a lot of training and experience and supervision around family dynamics and communication, different things that pop up just working with family systems. And while I don't have any specific trainings in couples counseling, like I have the certification in TFCBT, it kind of came up there, and it's something I've been doing in my private practice, and I plan on keep doing it. It's challenging, it's interesting and rewarding.
Okay. So TFCBT, trauma focused CBT. Can
Hmm.
we rewind it back for our
Yeah,
listeners and watchers and talk about what is CBT?
cognitive behavioral therapy. It's and the highest likelihood is if you're seeing a therapist right now, they're probably trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. And when I talk to my clients about that, what that is, because some of them will say, Kyle, do you do CBT? And
Of
oh
course.
yeah, any therapist you talk to is probably trained in that. And it's just a fancy way of saying that our thoughts and feelings influence our behaviors. I often refer to like what's called the cognitive triangle, that those three things are connected. And it's very common right now. And um, as you talk to your therapist or as you do therapy, you might even find that there are some behaviors that you can change that influence how you think and feel, and that'll be one of some of the skills that your therapist might give you. And depending on the context, it might be appropriate to do that with couples, right? Because a couple is two people, and while there might be communication issues within the couple, sometimes we have our own individual things that we need to work on that we bring to the table.
Okay. So cognitive behavioral therapy, and also I put a triangle CBT, so cognitions, behaviors, and thoughts, right?
Feelings, yeah, yeah, thoughts, feelings,
Feelings.
and behaviors, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
When we talk, when your therapist talks about cognitions, they're just talking about thoughts. It's
Yes.
a fancy word for thinking. So,
Yeah, so I try to put it like this to people because this is how I see CBT. You can break it anywhere in that cycle,
hmm,
the cognitions, the feelings, or the behaviors. And so it's like people get upset, like this is a cycle. It's just feeding into itself, which is true, but also if you look at that triangle, you can break it, or if you look at it more like a circle, a cycle, like cogs of a wheel, like you need all the parts of a wheel. If you break it in any one spot, then you have a broken wheel. And in this case, it's good. We can break those habits.
Right, right. That's the feedback loops that
Mhm.
we get caught in. And that's definitely part of the therapeutic process, identifying like where in that chain we're caught up. Um, yeah.
Um, I wonder if we can you think of an example where I or somebody might be feeling a certain feeling and they do a behavior that maybe is not helpful, and it kind of the feedback goes back around? Can you think of?
Hmm. Yeah. So there's so many. I think a common one might be um, when I'm working with somebody who's very anxious. One of the ways that I can tell, is they're often seeking reassurance,
Hmm.
right? So something will happen and they'll be perseverating or fixating or thinking about it over and over again. And then they're not sure if it's working, not sure if it's going to go okay. And so they'll ask people. And it's like, well, I think my partner has anxiety. Like they're always asking for reinsurance. Like, well, that's pretty astute, right? So something happens, right? There's a behavior, and think, well, the thought is, well, did that go okay? Did that work? Or is this going to work? Or is this going to go wrong? Like, oh, I'm not sure, and they start to feel anxious, and that anxiety drives them to maybe seek reassurance, or that's sometimes where some rituals can develop that might look like OCD or
Mhm.
or things like that. Yeah, earlier used the expression cycle when I worked in the sexual abuse treatment program. That was actually an exercise that we had the people do, is they work identifying their cycle of problematic thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And in their specific case, it led to sexual offending.
Hmm.
But everybody has a cycle, just not necessarily a cycle of abuse.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Um, all right. So why don't we get into more of the relationship
hmm,
ways that you help people in relationships? Who do you usually help? How do you usually help them? I know that there's probably not one
oh,
way.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it, and um, how I usually approach it. I know it might be common practice for some people to have like two individual sessions initially, where you meet with one part of the couple and then the other. And I usually have them both come in at the same time, and because I want to see how they interact.
Mhm.
I expect that they're going to tell me different things and they're going to have different perspectives. That's to expected. So right from the get-go, I have both of them come in, and I start with where they're at, whatever's bothering them the most, and I have them like talk about that. Sometimes it's like really dramatic stuff like infidelity. In other cases, it's relationships can be a death by a thousand cuts, where there's just lots of little injuries and disappointments and things like that accumulate over time. But in either case, I'm also looking at how they respond to each other. Sort of asking myself, like, okay, where's the empathy in that relationship? Like, how do they appear to be patient and understanding with each other? Because that's how empathy might look.
Hmm.
When I was a college student, it might probably was in my undergrad, that I stumbled on Carl Rogers in one of my psych classes, and it was just absolutely blown away. He had this idea of unconditional positive regard, like be warm and understanding to your clients, and the therapeutic relationship will do 90% of the work. Like,
It's
whoa,
true.
therapy can be that easy. I just got to be nice. I can be nice. And I kind of I operate with his definition of empathy, which sort of describes it as a process of like listening and understanding, but reflective listening. What therapists are trained to call like active listening. So somebody will say something, and you'll use part of what they're talking about to sort of like, oh, it sounds like you're telling me this. Like, can you tell me more? And you'll sort of describe what this is.
Hmm.
um, Empathy not just as a feeling. It's like, oh, Kyle, you need to have more empathy for somebody. And it's like, okay, like I need to have more feeling for them. But it's not just a feeling. Like going back to that CBT thing, like it's also a behavior. do they act empathetic toward each other? Is there any eye rolling going on? They
Mm,
are they only focused on what their experience is, and not what their partner's experience is?
mm,
When I do my sessions with couples, I I I want to see if they're able to do that, because empathy is one of the it's the lifeblood of the problem solving mechanism of the relationship. If there's no empathy for each other, then there's no understanding, there's no concern, and whatever's obstructing that empathy is like the things we need to get out of the way.
mm. How, I mean, how does somebody know when it's time to go into relationship counseling, I wonder?
Mm,
Like if we were to
yeah.
catch it right when we were supposed to,
Mm.
what would that be?
I've worked with some couples that come in sort of as a preventative thing, and that's always so interesting, right? Like they come in and it's like, things are going really good between us, and like uh, we can listen to each other. We just want to get rid of some bad habits. I'm like, okay, like, well, what are your bad habits? Because the bad habit that I'm looking for is like, I'm so hurt and frustrated and disappointed. I don't care what they have to say anymore.
Mm,
I don't, I'm completely exhausted. I'm burnt out. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy,
mm,
right?
yeah.
Uh, and when I think, to sort of answer your question, I think the best time to come into couples counseling is one when you feel like you can't do it anymore, like the two of you just aren't able to do it,
Mm,
and you start feeling yourself drifting into that direction of like, I really don't care what they have to say. Because it doesn't happen overnight. Like, it really is cumulative. Like, one analogy I'll use in my sessions, like when you buy printing paper at Target, and there's 500 sheets, right? But like there's 500 sheets that make it like that. Like one by one, they stack up on top of each other. It can be like that. And as you feel that popping up, it might be worthwhile to come talk to somebody. Unfortunately, sometimes people come in when they're way past that point. Some people look for permission to leave. It's
mm,
like, I feel like I'm at my wit's end. I've done everything I can. I want this extra set of eyes on it. And if they tell me that this is going nowhere, then I can finally give myself permission to exit, particularly if it's a marriage, particularly if their lives are deeply intertwined with like a house, a children, maybe even a business.
mm,
No, almost nobody enters into such things lightly, and sometimes people come to counseling at that point. Like, I'm at
okay.
my wit's end. And um, you know, one of the, and this is a little bit off topic, but um, the whole function of our nervous system is to save energy and keep us safe.
Mm,
And if we're with somebody who's hurting us, like, that costs energy and it hurts, right? Because we're managing stress, we're managing anxiety. That's exhausting. Even if it's a low-lying thing, that's a consistent tax on your system. you know it's like if you left all the lights in the house on all the time, it's like that's going to add up. And
mm,
when you're constantly in a state of conflict or unresolved conflict or avoided conflict, like, the lights are always on, you're never resting, you're never recuperating, it's stress. um,
that
and
makes
if
so
you
much
have
sense.
somebody who's disappointing or frustrating, your needs aren't being met, um, our brain is like, hey, something's not right up there, and but we need to keep the system safe, so that valve gets shut off, right?
Mm,
You stop caring, you stop asking them how they're doing, you stop trying so hard, like, whatever that looks like.
wow. And that must, I mean, if there are kids and other things involved too, that must spill out, that stress spills out to everybody else. Maybe, having more arguments with the kids or mm, ignoring things in your business that you shouldn't be ignoring.
Hmm.
Sounds, I bet it has a domino effect for some people like that.
And absolutely, and really, those things are kind of what people end up using to justify putting up with the things that they put up with.
Mm,
If somebody's like, oh, my partner treats me this way, like, oh, why do you put up with that, right? And it's like, sometimes, like, they worry, like, Kyle, when I came in here, I thought that's just what you were going to give me a hard time. And as a therapist, if I can't be empathetic when we're talking about being empathetic, like, that's, I'm failing. But if you have so many of those pressures, it does keep a person, it keeps you together. So you end up tolerating more than you might have otherwise, and it doesn't help somebody to be so hard on themselves, and I certainly am trying not to add to that. Um,
So say there were two people in a relationship, one whose needs are not being met at all, and they keep saying it, they're not getting a response, and the other person feels great, but they're
mm,
kind of maybe like just doing whatever they want, and no consequences. They think the relationship is perfect. Like, how do you even get that person to want to come? I don't
mm.
know.
Yeah, and sometimes therapy, couples counseling can be that, right? Sometimes therapy can look like that, where and often it's that way in breakups too, where one person has been contemplating it for a while. Like almost again, nobody makes big life changes lightly. Almost nobody makes big life changes lightly. One person will feel ambushed, and the other person will have been thinking about it for a long time. And when in the situation you're describing, Deirdre, what I'm thinking in something like that is is this because the other person doesn't care? Is this because the injured party is struggling to communicate? Like, do they struggle to communicate, or do they not communicate? Is it a failure of skill? Is it a failure of effort? Like some combination of the two. Um, it's not always obvious like what it is. So it's usually one of those things that you have to dig into. If you have somebody who's really, I mean, the possibility of somebody being so mean and selfish that they just don't care,
Hmm.
it's like that's unlikely. It's like you do have to remember, these people got together for a reason, you
Yeah.
know, and that's the easy part. Right? Getting along, anybody can get easy. Anybody who's worked with me, I talk about that. So getting along, anyone can do it. So easy. Anybody can have a good time. Everybody gets along on vacation, right? But life has a way of happening where it's really difficult. Business might fail, children might get sick, people will pass away, people's health will change, um, you know, and that's when you find out. And if it's a matter of the injured party not communicating, then a part of the process is working on what we call assertiveness training, which is identifying their needs and wants and developing strategies to communicate them, working on confronting the anxiety that comes with being assertive and speaking up. Some people are afraid of conflicts. Almost everybody's afraid of rejection, and working through that. But there are also situations where that training, you get conditioned to expect rejection, and it
Mm.
becomes the whole metaphor of the elephant tied to the tree. It's like you stop trying. You can untie that elephant who's been tied to that tree for a long time, but it'll never leave. It'll never go any further because it learned to stop trying. Right? It doesn't go anywhere. And disappointment hurts. Like it's one thing to, if you and I say, all right, after this podcast, we're going to go get pizza. We're not. But if we did, it's like, oh, cool. I didn't know that. Like, that's fun. But if before we talked, it was like, we're going to go get pizza. But then afterward, I said, no, actually, we're not. It's like that would hurt way
Ouch.
more.
Yeah.
The anticipation of getting a reward has us at an emotional high. So when we don't get it, you drop way down. The dopamine just crashes. But if it's a surprise, you're kind of in the middle, and then you get some good news. And relationships are you're always on the same ride with them. Whatever that up and down is. And if you have this expectation of your partner that they're going to treat me a certain way, then they don't. You do that to your brain several times. Your brain is like, yeah, we're not getting excited anymore. We're going to lower our expectations because that dip hurts us a lot. And it's something that happens outside of our control, right? A lot of our consciousness is beneath the surface.
Okay, so case example, so imaginary case example.
Hmm.
There's a couple. There's one who communicates but gets shut down, and then this other person shuts them down not because they're a bad person, but because they just never learned how to deal with conflict. And so then the first person who was bringing it up stops bringing it up, and then resentment comes up, and then this person still feels fine, and this person's just stewing. What do we do?
That's a very common thing to see in couples counseling. And usually, the typical gender layout is like men are far more likely to be the one who struggle to recognize like what their partner is actually trying to communicate. Like, and at least in heterosexual relationships, women are far more likely to be the ones trying to identify and solve problems. Like it's not always that way, but that seems to be like the typical layout. So in this example, I'll just say husband and wife, even though that's not like a law.
Mhm.
Um, if it's the husband, um, minimizing, denying, like really not paying attention. Uh, Sometimes just coming to couples counseling is sort of like message like, oh my gosh, like this is where our relationship has gotten. Like I really wasn't paying attention. Like I
Mm.
didn't really realize like how serious this was. Sometimes it you need a third party to say it. Anybody who has children, it's like you'll see how well behaved your kids are at a club or a sport or at school. And
Yeah.
I think at Vestal of report cards, the second marking period report cards came out a couple of weeks ago. And you read these things about your kids, like this isn't the kid that comes home, works hard, listens the first time, pleasure to have in class. Of course, we love our children. But what happens is we get desensitized, and this is like one of the ironies of a long-term relationship, is we get desensitized to our partner. We get desensitized to their requests, and maybe they're nagging. We get desensitized to their anger and disappointment. The same way you and I help our clients with anxiety and agoraphobia, our phobias is like repeated exposure. That same repeated exposure to each other's disappointment, we can get numb to it.
Mm.
And coming to couples counseling, it's a third party saying it or a third party pointing it out, or just that change of environment and routine just makes it more noticeable, more salient. It changes the tone so they can hear it. Is it sort of like, is it accidental? Do we get caught in our routines? Like, do we just have bad habits from our childhoods, or is it willful ignorance? Are they doing this on purpose? And then these are the things that kind of get explored in couples counseling. Like, what is the function of the behavior? Where does it come from? And if it's really, really complicated and really, really obstructive, it's appropriate for the couples counselor to suggest that individual counseling be implemented to address any blockages like that.
I think that brings up something in my head where a lot of times, so I only see individuals. Couples
Hmm.
are too hard for me. I'm so glad that you do couples therapy.
Oh,
But sometimes I get, oftentimes, as you said, in heteronormative relationships, it's
mm,
the woman oftentimes. So oftentimes I'll get the woman who comes in and sits down and says, well, I told my husband I have a problem with our marriage, and he suggested, since I'm the only one who feels this way, that I get my own individual therapy. So I'm here to make sure there's nothing going on
mm,
here. Uh,
mm.
and then, meanwhile, the other person is just kind of sitting home in la la land.
Right,
Um,
absolved of any responsibility and burden.
right.
Yeah.
In your opinion, do you think anything can be done from just if that's all we have to work with, if the other person's not coming in, is there anything to be done?
That's something that it's definitely something we see, right? That's not, unfortunately, that's not uncommon either, right? Like the whole notion of like passing the buck and, deflecting responsibility and blame. Like it's something that people do. Everybody does it, sometimes. And it's all about, I guess, degree. If that's something that's going on, um, you need to explore why it's like that. Um, I'll get into if it's an individual case, I'll get into, well, what have you said, and how have you said it?
Mm.
And how did they respond? When a therapist is starting out, your supervisor will have you do something called a process recording. He said, they said, and kind of getting into what your thinking was, and I'll kind of do that exercise a little bit with them. I don't make anybody write anything down, but
Mhm.
just getting into that back and forth because I want to see where the hangup is. you know uh, why are they saying that it's not their problem? But usually it's kind of telling that that dynamic is persistent in other aspects of the relationship. where one party just doesn't want to have responsibility or burden, and the one party ends up having to do everything for everybody, like the emotional labor, maybe the parenting labor. And when I say emotional labor, of like, I mean maintaining relationships with like outside parties, with the children, and the injured party is probably telling me something to the effect of being burnt out, anxious and stressed all the time, and I usually contextualize that to something to the effect of um, you're living the lives of two people, you're solving the problems of two people, and that's why you're so stressed out. Nobody is meant to be doing as much as you're doing. So one of the things we work on is, setting boundaries and following through, being consistent about them. Like, that's not something that I'm able to accomplish. I'm not going to be able to do that for you anymore. It's just too much. I can't do that. If the problems in the relationship persist, we talk about ways of maybe persuading that person to come in. Some people don't believe in therapy. They
Mhm.
just don't. And that's a reality that we have to work with. So we work within those restrictions.
Mm. Um, what about, I feel like I'm just grilling you.
No, I'm having, no, this is so fun. I love thinking about this stuff. Thank you, Deirdre, for having me on.
Of course.
Yeah.
Uh, what about like, I don't think it's that uncommon for one or both of the parties to like check out and get into a relationship with somebody else in their head, like having a crush,
Mhm.
um, or even acting on that.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. Do you have any insight about that?
Yeah, I do. That's a really interesting thing to bring up. So circling back to what we were talking about earlier, where like the whole function of our nervous system is to save energy and keep us safe. When I hear somebody is checked out, it's like the closing of that valve between the relationship where, we exchange time and energy to meet each other's needs, right? And within that, there's like a future self, and generally that's one of the things that keep a couple together. Compatibility of future goals, romantic attraction, ability to negotiate, and trust are like four important pillars of a relationship. And having those things to work on, having that connection, having that trust. If we're routinely disappointed in those areas, like we will shut up, but that doesn't mean the needs go away, right? Like
Mhm.
we close off, like we were talking about earlier. Like when do I come to couples counseling? When you feel that shutting, right? When you feel like you don't have a solution to the problem, you get an extra set of eyes. I think historically, our society was structured where like maybe we went to a religious person, or maybe we went to an elder of the family or an elder of the community. The way society is now, I think we've made therapists to be that, play that role, and we've always needed it. This isn't like we're no different than we've ever been, right? We're not screwed up. We've always needed a little bit of extra help. So anyway, when you feel that closing down, that it's it's to keep you from being routinely hurt and disappointed, but that doesn't mean your needs go away. So you still need to have that connection, maybe that stimulation, that affection, the sexual intimacy, whatever forms of romantic passion might be relevant. Um, that hunger might be there, and if a person finds themselves fantasizing, that's just the beginning, right? Like you're feeling lonely and you start fantasizing because the idea of getting that met is better than not getting it met. And
Mhm.
sometimes those fantasies start turning, as you're saying, into behaviors, and they act out. And that's usually how I treat infidelity. I don't Infidelity is sort of the tree that broke the camel's back. It's not it's it's not the first thing. It's like the big last thing that affected a relationship. Most of the time, it's serving a function. There's a point behind it. Something wasn't working in the relationship. I have worked with couples that had infidelity occur, and part of healing from that was recognizing what was not going well in the relationship, what needs the affair were meeting, and how to stitch that wound, how to close that wound, how to close that gap. So that person who, well, we'll say in this case, we'll say the person who cheated was seeking maybe some excitement and affection, and warmth elsewhere because they weren't able to get it in the relationship. Like, okay, now why? Like, were they not asking? You know, were they not vulnerable or safe enough to seek it out within the relationship? Was the other person not available? Were they not available because they weren't emotionally available? Were they not available because it was a very busy transition point, like new job, children, death of a relative, God forbid, all three, something like that, and no one was available? Like what was it? Was it a confluence of factors? Like these are the things that get explored in our sessions.
Mm.
And and it's usually really hard to do that because you have to sit in that space and that pain.
Mm. So I'm imagining somebody listening to this and hearing like, oh, I cheated because she wasn't meeting my needs.
Sure, sure,
What,
yeah.
what would you say?
And what I would say is, you know, she might not have been meeting your needs, but you chose to deal with it that way. Like you
Mm.
had a lot of other options, right? And this is no way, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's not useful to assign blame exactly like that. If your needs weren't being met, you have a responsibility to your partner to communicate that, right? And did you or didn't you? Uh, One case I worked with a few years ago, it was the husband who cheated, and he didn't communicate anything at all. He didn't ask. He had a very complicated internal world that nobody had eyes on except for him. And nobody saw it coming except for him because he wasn't talking about it. And of course, his wife felt very much like it was her fault, like she wasn't doing something enough, but she wasn't even given the chance to fail. And sometimes that's the case, right? And even if, you ask your partner to meet one of your needs or to be some kind of way and they don't, like the first solution shouldn't be to cheat on them. Like that's absurd, right?
Yeah.
Like there's 1,000 things that you can do before that. Like you can talk about it. And sometimes you have to talk about how to talk about it in order to talk about it. How do we talk about our problems? What's the best way to say things? What are things I shouldn't say? And even what's the best time to say things? I know
Mm.
as a therapist dealing with these things all day, I had to kind of figure out the time of day when I talk about things. I'm usually not good to talk to right after work, so it's first thing in the morning. But you know what that means? I have to be ready to talk about things first thing in the morning.
Yeah. It's hard with
That's
the busy
part of it.
schedule.
Right, right, right. And everybody's busy. It's not unique to me. Um, and sometimes you have to figure that out. And in cases like that, sometimes it has to get down to those bare bones.
Um, okay. So what if, say, for example, a woman cheats and the husband just can't get over it. And the woman's like, well, it happened and there's
Mm,
nothing I can do about it. And so I can't keep reliving it. I can't keep
mm,
apologizing. What do you want me to do?
mm. Yeah, that that's a tricky one, right? Part of the process of healing from infidelity, and this is something that I let them know right from the get-go, is you're going to need to be patient with and need to acknowledge their hurt and betrayal. And there's something about infidelity itself that's selfish and entitled,
Hmm.
where like I'm not getting my needs met and I have something that I want and I can go get it.
Hmm.
So any echo of selfishness and entitlement is going to activate that betrayal injury to the other party. So if they're going to heal from it, like it's not okay to say, well, you just need to get over it because again, they're taking it upon themselves to decide what their time frame should be, how it should go, and how they should feel. When that's kind of what they did when they cheated, right? So it requires some patience and humility on their part. That being said, how long are you going to be angry and what are you angry about? Like for some folks, that's a betrayal that there's no coming back from.
Mhm.
And in life, we can't always know everything from the get-go. We have to go through things to learn them, right? Like there's three ways to learn: experience, observation, and instruction. And some people think, okay, I can do this. I've read stories on the internet, people have gotten over it, and then they get into the thick of it. It's like, emotionally, I just can't.
Mhm.
Emotionally, I just can't. Or maybe I've actually seen the opposite, where like I always thought if this happened to me, I would just leave. And then they're in it. And it's like the pressures of the world, like, no, I want to see this through, you know. Um, and everybody needs to be patient, like the therapist included, right? The therapist is a human being like everybody else. The therapist has to be patient with the process and be mindful that the couple is has their own patience, and to not become reactive to their experiences, right? Like there's a parallel process there.
Mhm.
And um, the time it takes to explore why they're hung up, why they're not moving forward, is it varies from person to person. But also, just like with grief, when somebody dies, like, like the first month is great. People say not great. The first month is okay because you're getting a lot of attention. There's so much to do. Everybody's asking you how you're doing. There's so much support, but then eventually you're just expected to go back to normal,
Yeah.
right? And after the affair, sometimes there's like a love bombing type phase where there's a lot of compensating going on, and everybody's interested in being the partner that they always should have been, and things feel better. But then a memory creeps up, or a word creeps up, or a smell, or a story, or a scene from a movie, and it needs to be rehashed, right? A part of the cognitive behavioral therapy is thoughts. And we think of ourselves as a character in a story. That's kind of how our brains work. That's why stories appeal to us. Uh, and the character has an arc, and our life has a meaning. And as we go through our life, if there's anything that reminds our character, our story of that event, we have to reprocess it, right? And it's the same with grief. Like it takes a while for grief to find its place inside of us, because we need to live a little bit to find out where it's going to land, to find out what the meaning is going to be to us, what we're going to learn from it. And so it is with infidelity, because that's a grief of sorts. Somebody thinks that they're in this kind of relationship, and then an affair happens. Like, oh wait, my relationship's not like that at all. Like that doesn't actually exist. Like that's a death of sorts,
Mhm.
and you literally, your identity changes. The story of your relationship changes. And when the story of your relationship changes, the story of you changes. And then how you think of your future changes. Like, and that takes a lot of time to go through.
That's almost worse than a death because you're looking back and thinking it was never how I thought it was.
Yeah, right. There's some embarrassment that goes with that. I've seen some embarrassment goes with that. Some deep sadness goes with that, and that needs to be worked through. And people don't always know. People don't always know how they're going to feel. And even the partner who cheated, like they didn't know that this was what it was going to be like, sometimes, and sitting with that. But also, it's important that everybody sits with that, because that kind of vulnerability and emotional understanding, empathy, and connectedness, like that's actually going to be what protects them from infidelity in the future. Like if they can sit with each other's vulnerability, whatever kind of emotion that is, in the future, it's a protective factor, right? Like acting out that process. Like, look, like this is hard, and this is going to be what your relationship looks like moving forward if you're going to stay together. So practice it now. Like, let's work that out. Because if you guys are connected at that level, open and honest with each other, you're not going to be so inclined to look for it elsewhere. Now, like there are a lot of reasons to cheat. Like I'm talking like from the point of view of compensating for a deficit. Like there are people who have maybe addictive tendencies, um, or just in general, like a fear of intimacy and vulnerability, that they compensate by seeking like casual connections. If they don't want to examine that, like that's an individual issue, not a couple's issue. If that doesn't want to be examined, then that's going to be that. I'm talking about infidelities that occur as a compensatory thing.
Okay. Um, Okay, so what about not wanting to rock the boat? Right?
Yes. Oh, the people
Or-
pleasers, Deirdre. The
Well,
people
but it's
pleasers.
like I
Yeah.
never get a break and it's finally calm. But
Yeah.
there's this thing that I have to address, but I don't want to address it.
Oh, right, right. When life happens, long day at work, the kids were tough. You just want to sit down, but something's bothering you. It's like, I don't want to fight tonight, or I don't want to talk about it. It's just too hard. Yeah, that's one of those things that like slowly we talked about, like the sheets of paper, right? If we give into that habit too much, again, it's not about being perfect. Everybody, Michael Pollan, he's a writer. He had that documentary on Netflix called Cooked. Uh, he said everything in moderation, even moderation. It's like I like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need to give ourselves a bit of grace, right? You know, at the end of a long day or whatever it might be, like not wanting to rock the boat. It's like, yeah, I understand that. Like that's okay as a one-off. But if eventually it can become something where you're just kicking a bucket down the road. And here you have this bucket filled with stuff, like mess that you don't want to deal with. And you kick that bucket and it goes down the road. And how long do you kick that bucket? That road just gets covered with that mess. Sometimes the only thing worse than a conflict is a conflict deferred, put off into the future. And my folks who struggle with, and I had a session earlier in the week actually with a young man. He's like, I hate conflict, but the only thing I hate more than conflict is like a bigger one in the future. So that's what I used to tell myself to do it now, right? Like this whole
Mhm.
cognitive thing. Uh,
Yeah.
what's the thought? Like I hate fighting. So how does he feel? Like afraid, and how does he act? Avoid it. Like okay, so what's the belief? Like, well, I hate fighting, but a fight in the future is way worse than a fight now. So
Mhm.
oh, it's okay. So that sounds way scarier. So he feels a little braver. He feels a little more courageous. So he makes the decision to have the conversation now, right? And solving that problem like moves them closer and closer together.
It's funny, that's how I remember that I learned how not to lie as a kid.
Mm,
I remember my mother telling me, well, lies usually come out, so might as well just say the truth now and you could skip all the other drama that comes with me finding out.
right.
Um, and since then, of course, I'm a human. Like I sometimes I lie by accident, but for the most part, I try to just like blurt out the truth, not blurt it, but sometimes yes, as fast as I can, so that because I'm almost like afraid that I'm gonna lie. It's so easy to just do the
Mhm.
easier thing, and it's another that's a whole other ball of wax, but it's a way of protecting yourself,
Well,
right?
for sure. Yeah. And an example of that when I talk about it's when I talk with folks in sessions, like whether it's a couple or an individual, we have negative emotions and they serve a function. It's worth paying attention to the things you're afraid of and the things you're anxious about. Like they serve a purpose. Our ancestors who didn't get afraid or have anxiety probably got eaten or probably starved to death. So uh, they're useful to listen to. And it's about putting our negative emotions behind us where they move us forward, not in front of us where they make us stuck. And I liked that example of what you were talking about lying. It's like, I'm afraid of what will come from this, but like it'll be way worse if I lie. So that negative emotion goes behind you where you move forward rather than where you stay stuck.
Yeah, yeah. Plus the lies just pile up because you gotta,
As they pile up, right, right, right,
yeah.
right. Yeah. And
Um,
then you don't know what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. So how in the world do you fix anything? And sometimes marriage counseling is or couples counseling is that,
mm,
like unraveling the lies that have accumulated over the years. And, not only is there like not talking about what's going on, but misrepresenting what's going on that makes problem solving really difficult, and this whole conversation started with empathy and like empathy is the problem solving mechanism of the relationship, so like trying to connect with that so we can understand each other and communicate.
so empathy is the thing that we use in order to connect with the person, in
Hmm.
order to understand their needs and their needs get met,
Hmm.
expressing your own needs. How does that
Hmm.
work?
Right. So, and when you're training a therapist, they talk about, really make sure you tune into your clients, and that's understanding like what they have going on in their life, like what their background and context is, what their goals are, and responding to them from that place. And all a therapist is a professional listener, right? And when we work with our couples, like helping them be professional listeners to each other, like what is their context, like maybe what are their triggers, what sets them off, like what's important to them, and not losing sight of that, right? If they have things that they care about, things that are important to them, and hurt people. Isn't that a big saying in AA? When I have people come into my office, I just assume everybody's a good person, and if anybody makes a mistake, it's just a hurt person hurting a person, because that's what people do when they're hurt, and seeing that, like, oh, that person's not acting this way because like they're a fool or they're a jerk or whatever. But it's a misguided attempt to get their own needs met or keep themselves safe, because safety is a need, security is a need, right? Security isn't just um, something related to a password on your computer, but it's emotional stability, it's financial stability, things like it's everything like that. Housing, food, professional, all that stuff is security. And if we don't feel safe with our partner, like that sense of security is gone, and people will become defensive, right? They'll become defensive if they feel like they have to keep themselves safe. But the problem is, when we get defensive, we're not just keeping all the bad stuff out, but we're keeping all the good stuff in too. There's not that exchange, there's not that understanding. And generally therapists, the couples counselor can function as sort of a referee, where, okay, like that person, like the therapist is here, so we have to fight fair with each other because somebody else is watching, right? So they can have an exchange, right? They can start being honest with each other, and hopefully ideally a fair way. And you have to let them go, you have to let them talk. I don't have a whistle. Maybe I should get one. Maybe I'd be a better therapist if I had one. But you do kind of have to blow the metaphorical whistle, like, hey, like, was that a fair way of saying it, or was that a fair thing to do? Um, and then sort of having them communicate with each other in a more sustainable way.
If I did couples therapy, I would have a whistle.
Can't believe I never thought of it till now.
I think you should get one.
Might have to. I know a coach. I can probably get one.
Awesome. Well, so as we wrap it up, is there anything that we missed? Is there anything that you would like to end on or package it up with, or should we just call it a day?
For anybody who's listening, like, thank you for listening. If you're listening to this because you've been thinking about whether or not you should give couples counseling a try, I'd say go for it. If you took the time to listen to everything that we talked about today, then it's probably speaking to something inside of you that's important. And when you go and do it, make sure your therapist feels like a good fit, because you're talking about the things in your life that are probably the most important to you, the most sensitive to you. And if you don't feel a connection to your clinician, to your therapist, then you're not going to be able to go to those places. And you have to go to those places. You have to be able to talk about those hard things. And if you can't, you're going to be stuck in the same feedback loop that Deirdre was talking about in the beginning. And the whole point of this is to break that. Even the whole point of this discussion today is to help people break those things.
I think that's wonderful advice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you, Deirdre,
much.
for having me. I'll talk to you sometime soon. Thank you again.
All right. Bye-bye, guys.